made available to you after the whole 4-webinar series is complete. All right, it is now recording. Okay, so Carly is here with me and she will be monitoring the chat as we go. So if you have questions along the way, please feel free to put them in the chat, and there are some times where we have designated for questions. I am going to try to share my content. It's been a little glitchy today, but hopefully we can go now to the slides. Yes, all right, excellent. So as you know, our topics today are really broken into 2 parts. First, we're going to talk about physical fits. And some of you may know quite a bit about this already, but I'm hoping we can deepen your knowledge today about what the lab can do and why it's beneficial to send those requests into the lab rather than doing them yourselves in the field. And then the second part of today's presentation will cover investigative lead searches involving make, model, year information. And that will include both make, model, years, which we abbreviate as MMY, make, model, year searches using paint, vehicle paint, as well as make, model, years involving vehicle parts that may have manufacturing codes on them. So to begin, what is a physical fit? Now, some of you may know this by another term. It's historically, even within OSP, been called physical match. Sometimes you also hear it referred to as a jigsaw fit, but they all basically mean the same thing. Physical fit is kind of the hip new term for it. And really, it's when the conclusion is made that the 2 items, the broken items, were at one point one item together. So we reach that conclusion if an item has been broken, torn, or separated, and the physical features that we see correspond along that broken contour, and they realign in a manner that is not expected to be replicated just by chance or random occurrence. Now, that's an important concept because we do expect on this random, we do depend on this random breakage in order to reach a strong conclusion for physical fit. So that means it doesn't really apply to things that break or separate in a non-random method or manner. So for example, we wouldn't apply physical fit work to paper towels that are perforated or garbage sacks that are perforated, because these tearings usually are pretty reproducible in that there isn't much difference between one paper towel torn off the roll versus another paper towel torn off the roll later on in the roll. So we're really looking at items that have broken in a non-reproducible, more randomized way. So just like we do with our comparison work with glass and paint that you already heard about, we ask ourselves a series of steps as we do the physical fit analysis. And the first question that we ask ourselves is, can I detect any difference between these question pieces and the known pieces? So some of these pieces probably came from the scene. Some of these pieces probably are associated with a suspect or 2. Can I tell any differences between them just by looking at them or by doing other tests? So do they share class characteristics? And then secondly, do those broken edges align? And are there details crossing that break that correspond on both sides? So we're really looking under the microscope for that minutia that we can see that really proves to us that the items were once connected. Most of the physical fit work that we do are 3-dimensional objects, and we have a series of examples for you today to look at from our cases of the past. But we do attempt physical fits on flat objects as well, such as torn paper, tapes, and fabrics. Although tapes are fairly challenging for us because they can distort as they are torn, but we can attempt it, and we have had success in the past. And then just to put in your mind that when molded plastic items break, they can release kind of that tension that was in them from their molded shape, and they can change overall shape. So please don't be fooled at the scene into trying to fit something together and thinking, oh, this isn't a fit. It could be that the pieces have just deformed, and we have lots of experience with that. So send it in and we'll take a look. So as with glass and paint, sometimes you are at the scene and you see some items and you think, okay, I don't know if I'm going to have anything to try to fit these together with later, but I'm going to collect these items now. Those are typically your question items, some broken or torn object that you find at the scene of a crime. And then later, you locate some other objects or you search for other items that could possibly match up with that first set. So collect those items, and that would be the other section of the thing that we try to fit together. As you can imagine, a lot of our physical fit requests involve vehicle parts. So let's look at a couple of examples from that, and then we'll look at some non-vehicle physical fits as well. So this first one, I think, is a great example of showing what the officer collected at the scene with really no real guarantee at that point in time that they would be useful at all. But we can see down here, let me turn my laser pointer on. We can see down here in this left lower picture that these were the loose pieces collected at the crime scene. So you can imagine some vehicle impact, and we've got, perhaps a tail light or side light, and most of this is red prismed type plastic. And then there's some gray plastic and even some clear plastic and some, I think, a little bit of glass. And then later on, through excellent investigative work, a vehicle was located as a suspect vehicle. And so this piece was removed from that vehicle and sent in for a physical fit comparison. So at the point where this is collected, it probably wasn't even sent into the lab. It was probably just stored because it wasn't considered useful. But then when this piece becomes apparent, now we can work this case and see if there's a physical fit. So you can see that the loose pieces were assembled in such a way that they did fill in much of the gap on that broken piece. We're using a very high-tech scientific tool here called Scotch tape to put everything together and hold it in place so we can take our photographs, and you can see there's a side view as well. So obviously not all these pieces fit in there. There's probably some gaps that are still on the ground someplace in the real world, but we did put most of the thing back together. And the more physical fits we make with the various broken edges, the more these contours are shown that they do reassemble to make one item. And so we would conclude that these broken pieces that fit together with this housing assembly for this light were originally part of the intact housing assembly. This is a similar example, just using a larger light assembly. You can see from the notation that all the pieces marked with the Sharpie as number 4 were parts found at the scene on the ground, and then all the parts labeled with the Sharpie as 3 were obtained with the search warrant once the suspect vehicle had been located. And as you can see, they fit together to encompass almost the entire area of the light plastic itself. So we really encourage you to collect everything at the scene, even though there might be 20 broken pieces there, but go ahead and collect all of it, because we will look for multiple physical matches, and the more you have, the more convincing it is to a jury or a judge that, yes, this isn't just some random coincidence that these two pieces align together along the contour of the break, but they really fit together in multiple levels to make an entire object. So I know I've spoken with officers and investigators in the past who say, oh yeah, I did a physical fit at the scene, and no offense, but I always do a little cringe inside. Sometimes it really may seem very obvious at the scene that two things fit together. But we would like to convince you and persuade you to please send it into the lab, and this is why. So what we do know is that on any given object, there may be trace evidence on those pieces of broken object. And if you're trying to physically put them in contact with each other to see if there is a fit, there's a chance that you're transferring trace evidence from one piece to another, which could have important consequences legally down the road, because now you've basically contaminated one object with evidence from another object. So when we do a physical fit attempt, we screen for that trace evidence first before we ever put the pieces into physical contact with each other. So the picture here is a good example of that. What you're seeing here in this image is a broken knife. The upper part of that image above the break is the portion of the knife that was stuck in the victim's skull. I believe this was a fatal stabbing. And you can see there's a little bit of apparent blood here, this red-brown material. And the second portion beneath the break is the handle of the knife where it was in the hilt or the tang of the knife itself. So if you're at the scene and you're trying to take that handle off the suspect, or it's been recovered and now you're just placing it together with the part from the skull, any DNA that's on one could potentially be transferred to the other, even though it wasn't really there at the scene. You've just mixed them up. So please avoid doing that. Also, it's not really a problem with something metal like this knife, but if you do have plastic pieces or more fragile pieces, your attempts to fit them together at the scene may distort or damage the edges of the pieces themselves in such a way that our work is compromised if you do send it in to us later. We also have the great ability with the microscope that you don't have with the naked eye to see details such as scratches or patterns that are very convincing, and they really build the case. And so what we like to do in the lab is to take photographs using the microscope of those details in order to show later, if necessary, in testimony to the jury and the judge. We also, as I mentioned, screen these pieces for other trace evidence. So we may see something that is probative that just wasn't visible to you at the scene. So here's another non-vehicle example. This is a case from quite a while ago now, but it was an interesting one. It involved a burglary at a construction site, and I believe the appliance involved was a large generator. And basically the generator stayed at the scene, but someone had cut the power cord. I believe it was they thought it was to take the copper, which was very valuable. So the long power cord was cut, and then part of that insulation, empty insulation without the copper inside, was found at a storage unit associated with the suspect. So the question was, could this piece found at the storage unit make a physical fit with the end of the piece remaining with the generator at the scene? And so they didn't send in the whole generator, they just took this portion off, and that was great for this type of work. So you can just see pictures that are typical of physical fit pictures that we will take in a case. We're using a kind of a macro view here where we're taking a picture of the whole item and that breakage along here. And you can see these details are very corresponding across the break. And then we'll also take pictures under the microscope showing the fine details. So details of the minutia of that rubberized material and its contours. And then here you can see, I hope you can see on the slide, there are some striations that are just from the manufacture of this insulation, and they cross the break and are kind of parallel lines corresponding on either side. So once we've finished our physical analysis, what our lab reports will include is a description of the evidence and whether a physical fit was found or not. I will say that I think we're pretty high in terms of when we get a physical fit case, they almost always end up to be a physical fit, and that's because the investigators do have good instincts about whether something's going to fit together, and so they're sending in things that have a good chance of a physical fit being found. The one negative that I can remember in recent years is a torn glove was sent in, and then just a finger from a glove, and the question was, could these fit together? And that answer was no, because the torn glove already had 5 fingers. So eliminating the possibility that there was a 6-fingered glove out there, that one was clearly a negative. But most of the time, we are making physical fits with the evidence that you send in, and so we will document that, photograph that, and your report will state that a physical fit was found, and then it will most likely have an expert opinion that, in our opinion, these pieces found at the scene were originally part of the broken light assembly removed from the suspect vehicle, as an example. So basically what we're saying is that the likelihood that this is just random is negligible. And the more breakages and the more broken pieces that we can fit together, the lower that chance of just coincidence becomes. You may also receive a report with photographs included. It really depends on the nature of the evidence itself and the preference of the examiner. So we've looked a little bit about the association scale that we're moving toward in TRACE, and I'll have your attention drawn here to the top now, which is where we are with physical fit. It kind of outranks all the other conclusions that we can draw. Physical fit is the highest degree of association between items, and the observations provide the strongest support for the proposition that the items originated from the same source, as opposed to the proposition they originated from different sources. Sometimes, however, if a physical fit cannot be found, what we will then do, assuming that all the class characteristics are visually the same, is we may continue and take the evidence further and do some chemical or other physical examination to give a little better picture of whether they're even the same type of object. So in this example, on the left, we have a piece of asbestos flooring from an illegal dump site. Illegal because asbestos has to go through various safety regulations in order to be safely disposed of, and someone didn't want to pay for that expense, and so they just dumped it somewhere in the woods. And then on the right-hand side, we have a piece of similar looking flooring from the suspect residence. And the question was, do these pieces fit together? Well, you can imagine I only received these two pieces out of potentially multiple square feet of a floor, and the likelihood that these two individual pieces were going to fit together is pretty small, just because there are a lot of other pieces out there somewhere from this floor. But because this floor was so unique, instead of finding a physical match, I could move it into the trace miss category, which we'll talk more about next week, and just compare the physical features of its construction, the types of chemicals and dyes and pigments that were being used for the coloring and the layers of the flooring. Likewise, if a physical fit had not been made with that insulation from the generator cord, what we could have done was continue examination, because there were some unique paint applications on the insulation itself. So the insulation is manufactured to be black. This casing is a black material, black rubberized material. But at some point, it had undergone spray painting in both red and yellow. So I'm not sure you can see in detail, but there's red spray paint kind of peeking out here underneath the yellow, which was applied later. And on this one where the cracks are happening as that material flexed, you could also see the red. So if a physical fit had not been possible due to either damage after the event or some other factor, we could have compared the yellow paint to the yellow paint and the red paint to the red paint, and made some sort of conclusion as to whether they could be differentiated or not. We've talked about all this before, but remember that when we do a Q versus a K comparison, we're looking at them visually and with a stereo microscope first, and then we're using our instruments to compare chemical and elemental profiles or whatever is appropriate for the given evidence that we have. The difference between what we've talked already about glass and paint and what we're talking about now with physical fit and class characteristics of kind of just random items is we have less information about the populations of this type of product. What I mean by that is we have a lot of experience with glass. So we can tell from the data that we get, is this a common type of glass? Is this a rare type of glass? What's unusual about it? And same with paint. We're very good at assessing kind of, oh, I've seen this paint, dozens of times versus I have never seen this before. But if we're doing something like this flooring or some other kind of unusual matrix, we don't have that background information. And so it's harder for us to assess whether something is common or whether something is unique. And so our reports, therefore, are going to be less conclusive than they would for other types of evidence, like paint or glass. So when we look at where would we fall with the association scale, we're probably not going to get to this highly discriminating level just because we don't have enough background for that particular type of evidence, but we may be in either association with discriminating characteristics, which is moderately strong to strong support, or association with limitations, which is slight to moderate support. And of course, we could always exclude as well. The two things could be different from one another. So just a few reminders about physical fits. It's the strongest evidence for an association between two or more items in the trace world. That's the strongest we can get. If we don't make a physical fit, we may continue to conduct a comparison of class characteristics. That really depends on the evidence. And if a physical fit is made that answers the probative questions in an investigation, we will likely cancel other lab requests because the questions have been answered by the physical fit conclusion. However, that isn't always the case, and we will look at an example next week of when we made a physical match, but we still didn't cancel the rest of the work because it did not answer the questions about the scene. So how long does physical fit analysis take? We currently have 4 qualified physical fit experts. All physical fits are confirmed by a second scientist. Now, what I mean by that is we always have our cases go through technical review. Technical review means that someone is looking at our notes and our data and our report, and they're making sure they agree with our conclusions and we didn't make any mistakes, overreaches, underreaches, whatever. But a confirmation means that someone is actually looking at the evidence itself, not just your paperwork. So physical fits are confirmed by someone coming to look at the evidence, and they agree or not that your conclusion that a physical fit exists is accurate. And then a third scientist will do a technical review. So as you can imagine, this takes time. A given case may take 4 to 40 hours from start to finish. I think that glove one took me about 20 minutes though, so that was kind of a quick one. Our work, as always, may be delayed if we do not receive the incident reports from you. So we need to know the context of the evidence that you submit, not just what all the witnesses are saying. Really make sure the paperwork that we received with the requests document the evidence itself. And then if it goes on to class characteristic comparison, it may be assigned to a different scientist. It just depends on what abilities those scientists have. So the current turnaround time is quite variable. All right, have a little pause. Are there any questions? Now would be your time to type those in, because Carly's going to take over to start telling us about make, model, year searches with paint. All right, then I'm going to switch places with Carly and I'll monitor the chat for her.
All right, continuing on with make, model, year searches. This is definitely one of the services that I feel like is probably underutilized. And so I think it's really great that we're gonna explain a little bit more about it. We commonly do this type of request for any sort of hit and run incident or scenes where there was maybe a paint chip or a broken vehicle part that was left at the scene. And we kind of want to answer the question of what vehicle could this have originated from. So as the make, model, year search indicates, any sort of list that we will give you will be just that. It'll be like a Toyota Camry from model years 2009 to 2011. Sometimes the lists can be very short. Other times they can be rather long. However, they can be used kind of with witness statements too to kind of narrow it down even further. We also can do some make, model, year searchings with textiles, but it's far less common in our laboratory to do this. One thing that is great about the make, model, year searches is that it can be of use in helping to obtain a search warrant if there is a suspect vehicle that you're interested in and there was paint left at the scene. Send it in. We do try to prioritize any make, model, year searches to get them worked as quickly as possible to get a report out to you, since it is usually investigative in nature. So we use a PDQ database. PDQ stands for Paint Data Query, and it is run by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in conjunction with the FBI. Currently, there is approximately 23,000 vehicle samples in the database. And in basically doing our analysis, which I'll talk about in the next steps briefly, we can kind of generate that list of paint that was applied to certain vehicles in different plants from around the world. We can only do this type of stuff with things that were factory painted. So those OEM paint layers we talked about last week, we can only do the database with that because there's not a database for any repair paints. However, most of the time, or in a lot of situations, any repair layers are actually on top of those OEM layers. So even if it is a repaired area, we may not look at the most recent layers, but what's below we can use for the make, model, year searching. As I mentioned, the list can and will depend on the rarity of the paint type. For instance, we tend to have better luck, or there's more, I shouldn't say better luck, but there's usually more paint layers on metal car parts than plastic bumpers, for instance. And sometimes plastic bumpers can be manufactured in one plant and sent, or in one factory and sent to multiple plants. And so sometimes the list will be really large based on that. Again, it's all going to kind of just depend on the paint. But it is helpful, and like I kind of briefly mentioned, that depending on what the list is, if we have sedans on there as well as SUVs, and eyewitnesses are saying it's an SUV, you can kind of, at least from our list, narrow it down to maybe one or two SUVs that are on there. So the make, model, year searches we're doing with the analysis that we talked about last week. So we're looking underneath the microscope at the layer structures, and we're using a scalpel, and we're taking peels of each layer. So that clear layer, color layer, primer layers, each one of those, and we're going to analyze them via the FTIR that we spoke about last week. From the resulting data, we are able to interpret it and figure out what ingredients are basically in that paint. So when we talked about the binders and the pigments, that is all going to be shown in the FTIR data. So we can kind of come up with the list of components, and then we'll use the PDQ database to enter in those ingredients, and it'll give us a search with similar paints that are in their database. And we enter in the data for all layers minus the color coat. Once we've kind of gathered a list of similar looking data, we can determine the list of plants that could have produced those paints in certain years. So we'll go through them kind of one at a time and say, all right, starting in 2009, this paint system data matches what I have or resembles what I have. 2010, same thing. 2011, same thing. 2012, it looks like they started with a new paint system. So that's how we kind of narrow down the range of possibilities. Once we kind of have that list of models and plants, we can use some industry references and resources to kind of figure out which models were actually produced in those plants in that given year range. Once we have done that, we'll sometimes do a little bit of research to say, all right, here's this Japanese plant made, X number of models. However, none of them were shipped to North America. We will leave those off the list because they're not really helpful at that point. And so once we've kind of narrowed it down, we will issue our make, model, year investigative list and send it out for you all to view. So I mentioned that we don't use the color code in our PDQ searching, and that is because if we were to do that, we could narrow down the list of potential vehicles that, like, unnecessarily, I guess. So the database itself doesn't have paint samples in there for every possible color scheme. However, we have found that the primer layers and the clear coat layers are going to be the same at that plant. So even though the car may be red and a car may be blue, they're both going to have the same primer layers and clear coat layers. We don't want to kind of narrow the list down unnecessarily. So we leave that off for our make, model, year searching. However, it is useful later on, once a suspect vehicle has been developed and a standard has come in, we will go through and do the comparison of the primer layers, the color layer, and the clear coat layer. And sometimes, I mean, the color layer is highly discriminating one way or the other, just based on the pigments or those metallic effect pigments that could be in there. And things do kind of change over time. So even though it might, again, visually look similar, they could have differences through the years. All right, and I'm going to give you back to Chris to give you some kind of examples of how we have used this.
All right, yes, so that is a lot of information, but hopefully it gives you a little glimpse into what we're doing with those paint samples that you send in. Let's look at some examples so you can see it in the real world. So with this first example, we have a very common scenario where a parked car is sideswiped and the damage appears to have come from a red vehicle. And we say that because on the damaged vehicle, there was red paint transfer. There were red paint chips recovered from the ground, and then there are also plastic lens fragments. And remember those plastic lens fragments, they'll be important later on. So the samples that came into the lab were all of these things, some scrapings from the damage with showing the red transfer, the red paint chips, and then the plastic lens fragments. At that time, the plastic lens fragments and the scrapings from the transfer were not analyzed because these red paint chips had a complete layer structure from a metal panel. As Carly said, we do have better results typically with chips or paint from metal panels, just because they have more layers on them than plastic panels of vehicles. So those were analyzed. They were found to be OEM, so they're factory paint, and therefore we can use the PDQ database. And using that database, we produced a list of make, model, year vehicle combinations that could be the source of this red paint. So this mystery vehicle that just hit and ran, what vehicle could it be? And you see on the right that we have a reported hit list. And I would say this is a pretty small list in terms of the range of size of lists that we see when we do PDQs. The reason that I say it's small is that we have Fords and Mercurys, Mazdas, and Lincolns, but some of these are actually just model variants where they're made by the same factory, basically the same plant, and then two different logos are slapped on them. So the Ford Ranger truck and the Mazda V-Series truck is the same truck. It's made on the same factory line, but it's just branded as two different things. And you're seeing that here for the Lincoln Navigator and the Ford Expedition and so forth. So we also have a fairly small year range in that all of these possible source vehicles could only have come from the years 1998 to 2001. So that's a pretty small year range. So that information was given back to the submitting agency. And I don't know what they did, but they developed a vehicle that was a suspect vehicle, and it was a 2000 Ford Ranger truck. So you see that was one of the listed make, model, year combinations on our MMY list. So once they had that vehicle in their possession, they removed the damaged light assembly and sent me a red paint standard that could be submitted to the paint chips from the scene or to the transfer found on the damaged vehicle that had been parked. So where I started was I looked at that light assembly to see if we could do a physical fit, because if I can, that's probably the strongest conclusion that we can make at this point, and that would preclude other analysis. So those plastic lens pieces that were initially sent in but not examined are now really important. So here they are. You can see the mix is comprised of prismed orange glass, or excuse me, not glass, plastic, some black plastic, there's some clear plastic here as well, and then one of these kind of plastic connecting brads that hold plastic pieces in place. And then here's the damaged assembly that was removed from the suspect vehicle once the search warrant was obtained. And we, again, used the high-tech Scotch tape, and we're taping things together. So you can see Exhibit 1 are the pieces found from the scene, and Exhibit 4 are the edges of that broken clear plastic from the assembly that was obtained later. And then the orange prismed plastic, a lot of the pieces from the scene fit together with themselves. So they're kind of taped together into a panel, which then fit in nicely into some of the gap on Exhibit 4, the assembly itself. So again, at the time, when the officer collected these broken pieces, there was no guarantee that they were going to be of any use. And they actually weren't useful initially, but by having them in their possession, they became very useful later on. There's no way that the passage of time here, this is like 4 months between these two submissions, there's no way they could go back to the scene 4 months later and collect the plastic from the road to be useful. It's going to be worn and degraded and lost just through the passage of the elements and time. So collection of those pieces at the time of the event is paramount. The second example of a PDQ make model search with paint involves a more recent scenario. This one was an early morning pedestrian fatality. The pedestrian was in the middle of the street, crossing the street in the dark. There was a security cam that took some footage. However, because it was dark and the lighting in the area was poor, it didn't really show any detail that was especially helpful. Nothing could be observed of the plate or the driver inside the vehicle, but they could tell that it was either a dark gray or a black vehicle, kind of a sedan type model. The impact with the pedestrian did break off a large piece of the vehicle's bumper, or at least that's a suspicion. I mean, we can always say that perhaps this bumper was this broken bumper had laid in the middle of the road, for a while, and it just was coincidental that it was associated later with a body. But, we know that it's a pretty good guess, and we're going to work off that assumption to begin with. So here was the broken piece. You can see it is a plastic piece this time, and it's got a dark gray painted exterior, and then on the interior there are some handwritten markings. So Carly has already said that we don't have as good a chance with plastic parts as we do with metal parts. So I was not feeling very optimistic about this PDQ, or make, model, year search. When I looked at the paint layers on the plastic bumper, we have really just 2 layers. We have the clear coat, which, as you remember from last week, is a clear paint that's applied to protect the color coat and to make it shiny and glossy and all that stuff. And then we have the color coat here, which is a dark gray with 2 types of metallic pigments. However, we know now that for PDQ searching in the database, we don't use the color coat. So I'm left with only 1 paint layer in which to search the database, that being the clear coat. And these images are just here's the paint under the microscope when I've peeled it off the bumper, and here it is with just different lighting conditions to show that there are two different types of pigments, one that appears darker than the other when light is shining through it. So I took that clear coat, and as you remember, hopefully from last week, I am doing FTIR analysis to give me a spectrum that lets me know about the ingredients that are in the clear coat. Now, normally this technique would tell me about the pigments and the binders, but this is a clear coat, so we don't have any pigments. So it is all binder and all binder by itself. But clear coats are very high tech, so they are commonly a mixture of a lot of different ingredients. They're also very proprietary in that different manufacturers are going to use their own version and not share that information with other manufacturers. So there is a lot of difference potentially between the clear coats of, say, my Toyota Camry and someone else's, Ford Mustang or whatever. Who makes Mustang? I don't know. I can't remember right now. I'm on the spot. Carly tells me I'm right. So many car companies are buying each other and merging. I can't keep up. Fortunately, this clear coat turned out to be quite rare and unusual. So even though we just have one layer to work with, we actually produced a fairly usable list. So you can see here on the left, this is the PDQ make model year list that was generated. And I want to highlight for you that we do have one Chrysler plant that came up in our search. This Chrysler plant is what we're saying when we say a Chrysler plant came up in the list, is that the Chrysler plant is using a clear coat with that same set of ingredients or mix of ingredients during this kind of 2014 to 2016 period. And these are the two vehicles produced in that plant that could be the source of that paint. So a Chrysler 200 and a Dodge Avenger. So even though it's a Chrysler and a Dodge, it is the same Chrysler plant because Chrysler now owns Dodge. And then all the other possibilities were all Hyundais. So that is all coming with the exception of this one vehicle here, the Hyundai Sonata. All of these other Hyundais are from one South Korean plant. So the clear coat was being used primarily in this one South Korean Hyundai plant, and a little bit of it was being used in this second South Korean Hyundai plant. And you can see the list of models that we see. And this is where, as Carly mentioned, you can use video or witness statements about what kind of car it could have been to help narrow down this list even further. So if you have a screenshot of that video, you can kind of look at, okay, well, what does a Santa Fe look like versus what does a Tucson look like versus what does the Elantra look like, and kind of narrow it down to, well, it can't be this. I'm going to eliminate that just on the body shape. So this agency took the list. They developed a suspect vehicle. It turned out to be the Hyundai Santa Fe, and they located it parked in the owner's driveway. They got a search warrant using the list and the visible damage to the vehicle and submitted the entire bumper to the lab for analysis. So when I received the bumper, it actually had undergone some home DIY repair. So what you're seeing here is a combination of black duct tape, some sort of mesh, and a lot of spray paint to cover it all up. And this is the interior side where you can see some of the tape that has been overlaying, and then you see kind of this epoxy mesh repair that's been done. And then the whole thing was spray painted because if you just did the repair, now it's a pretty obvious color difference between the repaired area and the rest of the bumper. So they had actually spray painted the entire bumper to be a slightly darker gray than the original dark gray. You can see that color interface here where the tape was covering part of the original color, so that part didn't get spray painted. So they're obviously trying to hide the damage. So once I removed the patch so I could work with the existing contours of the breakage, It was a fairly nice fit. You can see the contours of the broken piece left at the scene fit nicely into the gap of the bumper. You can see that color difference here still. And then here's the inside, which I like even better than the outside. You can see that I'm leaving a slight gap in this photo just to kind of show the contours. But this yellow handwritten marking crosses that interface. So that's really nice because that would not be something that is a mass-produced feature. That is a feature that is probably much more unique, probably put on by an auto body shop or some repair shop. And then on the other side, between the brake or over the brake, you see these striations of scraping. So as this piece broke, some of those striations were on the piece left at the scene, and some of them were on the piece that was still on the car. So it's undetermined whether these striations are from the event in question or whether they were pre-existing, but it doesn't matter for our purposes. This is the physical fit that is made between the bumper piece and the piece left at the scene of the fatality. The contours all match, there's unique features, and there's overlapping, aligning striations across the brake. Very satisfying. Now, again, the officer was really on the ball here because they not only collected that obvious piece of painted bumper for PDQ work, but they also collected at the scene 2 pieces of broken gray foam. And this is very common. You've probably seen this type of foam insulation inside a bumper of a vehicle that you own or you've seen damaged. However, this one did throw us for a little bit of a loop because there were some spots of green paint on the pieces from the scene, but there was no green paint on the foam insulation on the bumper when it came into us. So remember, we're always looking at, can I tell the difference between these 2 items? And if one has green spray paint on it and the other doesn't, now I have a anomaly or something that I have to resolve. Like what could be the explanation for why these are different when all the other things tell me that they were originally one bumper. So that one was a mystery easily solved. I reached out to the officer and he sent me some scene photos and some information that yes, they had used that green marking paint on the road to kind of circle where these pieces were found. And so the green paint was explainable and the physical fit was complete. All right, so in both of those previous situations, both with the red paint chips from a metal part and the plastic bumper beam, the physical fit that was made at the end of the work was deemed sufficient, and so we canceled any other pending paint requests. However, in some situations, it's actually more important to prove that the vehicle made contact with the person. So we've kind of put the vehicle in the location, like they were damaged in that location. They left some parts behind. That's usually sufficient in order to either charge them, it goes to a plea, convince the jury, whatever. But in some cases, we really do need to make an effort to show if there was contact between the vehicle and the person or the vehicle and a bicycle, if we're talking about that kind of fatality. And so that's where we would continue analysis and do comparisons to either damage on a vehicle or clothing that has paint smears, bicycles that have paint smears, that sort of thing. So those requests are triaged among our lab staff with the investigators and the prosecutors. Knowing the context of that case from your paperwork helps us make those decisions accurately. All right, so that is paint make, model, year searches. Now we're going to look at make, model, year searches from manufacturing codes. Carly, are there any questions that have come through? No. Okay. How are we doing on time? Good. So this is a type of analysis that we have been doing more recently, frequently, but it's similar to make, model, years with paint in that we're trying to look at anything on these broken vehicle parts that would give us information about what could have been the source vehicle. So as you know, if there's a crash, some of the parts that are left behind at the scene are painted, and we can use those for PDQ, make, model, year. But a lot of times they will not be painted parts. They will be side mirrors, which may be unpainted plastic. They may be bumpers, which are sometimes just molded plastic rather than painted plastic. Light assemblies with all that refractive plastic and clear plastic. Those do not have paint on them that can help us narrow down the vehicle, make, model, year. However, they could have parts with part codes on them that can give us some directions to help the investigation. So just to emphasize, Carly did mention it already, but I just want to say it again because I think it is an important point. Even if we do receive a plastic piece with paint, the chance that we can give you a decent list for your make, model, year vehicle combos is lower because, as she said, you may have one big factory that's making bumpers for all sorts of plants, and then those bumpers get sent and put on the vehicles. And so that's in contrast to the vehicle metal body parts that are painted in the plant itself. So remember, all of our paint work is trying to narrow it down to what plant did this come from. But if the bumpers went from one building to 20 plants, now you're going to end up with an investigative list that is so huge that it's not really useful. And so you may get a report from us that says we can't generate a useful investigative list at all. So those plastic parts, however, could be a rich source of manufacturer's codes, and we will then switch gears and do this type of make, model, year search instead. So here are some examples. This is an easy one to start with, but I liked it because it was one of the first ones that I worked. So here we have a side mirror, and you can see that the glass is mostly gone. And if you turn it over, you'll see some imprinted codes from the manufacturer. And one of those imprinted codes here is RH, which tells us that it's the right hand or passenger side mirror. But very faint, there's also a little Ford logo. So that was like golden. We were, well on our way. If we know it's a Ford part, then we can start looking up these Ford parts codes, and we can determine that this mirror could only have come from a year range of 1986 to 1991, either a Ford LTD Crown Victoria, Ford Country Squire, or a Mercury Grand Marquis. And then just to remember that because they are merging car companies all the time, that the Grand Marquis was made by the Lincoln Mercury division of the Ford Motor Company. So really these are just 3 Ford vehicles and quite old as well. So that also narrows down the number of those vehicles that are going to be on the street still in, I think I worked this case in 2017 or something like that. This second example is a great, I think, highlight of why we ask officers or property scene folks, evidence technicians, to collect all the broken pieces that they see at the lab or at the scene, even if it doesn't look useful to them at the time. So in this example, we have an officer collecting all the broken plastic parts and mirrored glass. There's no eyewitnesses to the collision. And this evidence comes to us. And then I just have my third bullet point here is something I've said before. But just to emphasize again, we are totally willing to work these trace cases that are property damage level cases. We may have to triage them and put them after our person crimes cases, but this is how we build our skills. This is how we become experienced. This is how we stay proficient. And so please don't neglect to send it in or choose not to send it in just because you think the case is too minor. You may wait longer for the answer, but we would still love to receive that case for you because that's what we're here for. We are here to use our scientific expertise, all these expensive pieces of equipment that we have. we are here to be put to use for your investigation. So please utilize us. So here are the parts that were collected in this scene. And you can see there's mostly plastic parts. There's a little part of a light bulb here. And then these red plastic pieces were later determined not to be part of this other object, which turned out to be a side mirror housing. I'm not even sure that they came from the damaged vehicle. They could have been just on the road already. So my exam determined that the parts were from a passenger side vehicle mirror assembly that had a defroster feature and a downward facing puddle light. So that's determined just by looking at the parts that are received and kind of fitting them together. There were imprints found on the parts that showed that the parts themselves were made in 2006 and 2007. However, none of the parts had a code on it that let me link it directly to a vehicle make. So we've kind of narrowed down the years, but not really. However, if you look back at that set of pieces, there's this little housing here, which is actually the housing for the puddle light. So the light that shines downward, so as you're getting into your vehicle, you can tell if there's a puddle that you're going to step into. The puddle light housing had some patent numbers on it, and these patent numbers could be narrowed down to fitting only vehicles produced by Ford, Lincoln, and Mercury. And so we've got this narrowed down, and this is just a coincidence that my 2 out of my 3 examples are Ford, Lincoln, Mercuries. Criminals are not more likely to drive Ford, Lincoln, Mercuries than anything else. So now that I know that, I can take what is the overall construction of this reassembled mirror housing that I put together and start doing some internet searching with images to see if I can narrow down, okay, what kind of Ford, Lincoln, Mercury has a mirror that looks like this with these features. So I'm doing internet searching, and then we also have built some industry contacts that we can consult to get information about their expertise in this topic. So there were 3 particular features of this mirror that were unique and helped me narrow it down. There was a unique angle at the bottom of the mirror. We have these fins flared on the top surface, and then it had this 2-tone paint system where the top of the mirror housing matched the vehicle color, in this case a metallic gold, but the bottom of the mirror was just unpainted molded black plastic. So using those 3 features, as well as the Ford, Mercury, Lincoln information from the puddle light, we could determine that this side mirror was made for a Ford Taurus X, which is also known as the Ford Freestyle. Model years 2007 to 2009. So I'm sure everyone thinks, oh, Ford Taurus, there's a billion of those on the road. And that's true. Well, it's an exaggeration, but it's true. But the Ford Taurus X was a crossover SUV version produced only in one Ford plant in Chicago for a very short period of time, and fewer than 48,000 units of that particular model were sold nationwide. And so instead of looking at a very common vehicle, the Ford Taurus, we're looking at a much less common vehicle, the Ford Taurus X, which hopefully will help the agency with their searches to find the suspect vehicle. Now, this is, I think, the most frustrating part of being an analyst here, is that we send our reports out and we never hear anything else sometimes. So this report went out. I was so excited about it. Boy, we really narrowed this down. We know exactly what kind of car this is from. And then I never heard anything back. So I still don't know if they ever found a suspect vehicle or not. If they did, they could certainly send in a standard and we could do some paint analysis and comparison. Or if they haven't repaired the side mirror, we could do some physical fits with the broken part that's still attached to the car. So you have the internet, you have Google. Why send parts codes to the lab instead of doing them yourself if you're looking for make, model, year information? Just as with physical fit, we feel as though we have some resources that you don't, and so we would love to put them to use. We definitely have the microscopes that very few agencies have access to, and we have better lighting in the laboratory than what you'll have available at the scene, we assume. We can also use the cameras attached to our microscopes to document what we're seeing, and that may be crucial when a case comes to trial. The parts may require dismantling, and that's not something that we would really encourage you to do at the scene, but sometimes those imprints are on the interior surfaces. And so even of a broken part, we may need to take it apart further to get to those codes. So we would prefer to do that in the controlled conditions of the laboratory. These parts, as always, may have other trace or biological evidence on it, especially if a person was impacted by the part. It's not uncommon for a side mirror to sideswipe a person, and it could have hairs or fibers or other biological, like tissue or blood material on it. So again, we'd rather not have you have it at your desk, handling it to do make, model, year searches. Send it in, we'll do that screening before we pass it on for further work. If it's painted, obviously we might be able to do PDQ or do it in conjunction with a parts code, make, model, year. We have an established procedure, so you don't have to recreate the wheel. I know your time is very valuable. And of course, we do have those established industry contacts that may be more cooperative with us than with you. You never know. When we're finished with our make, model, year analysis, our reports will include whether the sample was even suitable for a generation of the list. So for example, going back to paint, if the only paint we see on the sample is repair paint, we won't be able to use PDQ database for it, so you won't get a list. You also won't get a list if the list that would be generated is ginormous and we're just not going to give it to you because it's not useful. Or there may be no part numbers that can narrow it down. But if the list is generated, then you will see it as usually a table of make, model, year combinations. We will also include a caveat that this list is provided for investigative use and is not to be considered all-inclusive. And that's because the resources that we use are not all-inclusive. The lab report will designate or outline what resources we used, and that's just kind of an accreditation requirement for us. And it may include a note about what further analysis could be done if more evidence is submitted later from a suspect vehicle. And I will point out for any of the legal community listening, it is very rare that we would testify about the results of a make, model, year search. That's just really not how it works. Instead, what we would do is the later comparison, and then that would be the subject of any testimony that we would do. There are some limitations about make, model, year work of any kind, and I think the first one I've already mentioned, that these databases and obviously Google searching, these are not all-inclusive methods. So could our list provided be incomplete? Yes, absolutely. But we're trying to just point you in a direction that we think would be helpful. We already talked about how only OEM paint layers can be used for PDQ, but even if we have OEM layers, we may have difficulty generating a useful list if we just have a smear rather than a chip, because we may be missing the primer layers, or the layers may have melted together in a way that we cannot separate them for analysis. We know metal substrate paint systems work best, so look for those paint chips that pop off that flexed metal panel as the impact happened. Those are the best chips for us to work with. And then about the codes, we do have more difficulty with codes on aftermarket parts than we do with factory original parts, but we have had success on aftermarket parts as well. So go ahead and send it in. Just to FYI too, for the deputy district attorneys, make, model work with parts codes is currently outside of our accreditation scope for reasons that are too nuanced to go into this presentation on, but feel free to ask us if this comes up in testimony. Please be aware that on some plastic parts, the codes that you see are for Department of Transportation requirements, and they just talk to us about what kind of plastics are being used. These are safety requirements by DOT. So they don't really help us with anything about the manufacturer of that vehicle. So again, our report would say that, but don't get your hopes up. If you see parts codes, they may not be the type of parts codes that are useful. And then this last bullet point is extremely important. We get this question quite often with glass. Can we do make, model, year searching with broken glass? No, we cannot. Unlike paint, which has this wonderful RCMP, FBI database, there is no similar database for glass. Part of the reason is that it's just too often replaced after breakage. And then the way that car factories get their glass is they're not making it themselves, they're buying it from somebody else, of course. And so again, like the plastic parts, one glass factory may provide windshields and windows to dozens of plants, especially if it's in a factory-rich region of the world like Detroit or something like that. So there's just not enough uniqueness from plant to plant with glass. But remember all the cool things we can do with glass. So what can we say in testimony? Well, as always, all of your scientists are going to be able to explain our analytical procedures. We can explain our findings and the meanings and limitations of those findings. We can offer expert opinions about the significance of those findings. Obviously, in physical match, we already talked about that, but with any paint comparison or a class characteristic comparison, which would fall under the MIS category, we can, if merited, offer expert opinions. And then, as always, we can talk about our lab's accreditation status and our quality assurance protocols. As Carly mentioned, we do treat make, model, year searches as priority cases when they come in, because we understand that it is an ongoing active investigation and you're looking for our help. So this is not a situation where you think you know who did it already and you're collecting evidence and we're just testing it when we get around to it. This is you're hoping for a lead that will help you figure out more information about what happened at the scene. So we do prioritize them. These cases usually go to a paint expert, and we currently have 2 trained paint experts in the state. That's Carly and me, and 1 in training that we anticipate will be finished by the end of the year. So these cases can take 40 hours or more. I would say usually more. Yeah, Carly's nodding. I would say closer to 80 for most of them. And when I say 80 hours, that doesn't mean I'm working on the case for 8 10-hour days straight. But you know, I'm adding up all the hours that it takes me over the weeks that I'm working it. And then, as always, the work may be delayed if we don't receive incident reports, but we do try to reach out to you as quickly as possible if we're missing some information that we need on these. Current turnaround time is less than 60 days. So what kind of evidence packaging do you need, or what should you send in? Basically, it's whatever you find at the scene in these. This is really easy. So protect those items from further breakage or damage. So put them in something sturdy, cushion them if you need to. Just try to get it to us intact in the condition that you found it. And that would apply to the parts you found at the scene, but also any part that you took off a vehicle or collected anywhere else to see if it makes a physical fit. Be sure to label that evidence with all the details, be specific, send in all the pieces, even without codes. That will allow us to reassemble the item to get an overall sense of the features and the construction to narrow down possible sources. And then if you do know VINs, so if you have a suspect vehicle, please always include that VIN information. We can use that VIN to figure out what plant it's made in, and then that can help us eliminate some possibilities in those make, model, year searches. When you submit that evidence, please submit as much of the evidence as possible. And then this is a little bit confusing, but we do have a set of 3 different request types to consider here. I apologize for this. If you are asking for a physical fit analysis, on the Form 49, it is still called physical match request. So that's what you want. If you are requesting a make model year search from a painted part, that is a paint polymer request. So it's a trace paint request. And if you're requesting make model year search from codes or from other information, it's not paint, that goes to an other or trace miscellaneous request. I know it's confusing. It's just the lab. I ask you to bear with us. Probably the most common difficulty we have with evidence of this type is it's just sharp because these are broken items and it tears packaging really easily. And I think it's tempting to kind of cram stuff into a bag and it's really tight in there, but please use sufficient room so that it doesn't make its way through the corners and pierce the packaging. And remember, we're going to need to close it up again after we're done. So just give us a little bit of room to work with. We're not going to talk much about these slides because you have seen them in the last presentation, but they're just here to remind you that we do advocate for a dual layer system for packaging with small items. However, with physical fit and make model year searches, you may have big items that don't require a double layer of packaging. But if you have paint chips, something like that, that's very small, please use the 2 layers. And here's just a reminder about the helpful items you can carry around with you at all times so that when you see trace evidence, you are prepared to collect it. And here's our contact information again. So I'm going to pause and stop sharing my screen. If you have any questions, now is the time to type them in. I would also remind everybody that if you haven't put your name in, if you're not logged in under your own name, if you haven't typed that into the chat, please do so before you sign out so that we can take attendance. And I'm asking Carly if there's any questions.
Although I don't know if it was last week that Jonathan asked if had a part of the manufacturer. I believe that he answered the question.
Tell me his name again.
Jonathan Mans.
All right, Carly is reminding us that last week we had a question from Jonathan Mansky about whether we can identify vehicles from unpainted vehicle parts. We're hoping that this presentation has helped answer that question, but if he's here and has any further questions, now would be the time to ask. While we're waiting just a few minutes to see if there's any further questions, I'll just remind you that next week we're talking about trace miscellaneous, and that you've seen it on our intro slide at the beginning of the presentation. Miscellaneous is everything else that doesn't fall into one of our pre-slotted categories like paint, glass, fibers, hair. It's a catch-all for everything else. So we're going to have some examples from cases that we've worked that span quite a variety, and I hope you'll enjoy it. All right, so we've answered Mr. Mansky's question, so we're good. All right, if there's no further questions, then I will say goodbye. I think we're exiting a little bit early today. That's great because we've pushed it just to the limit the last 2 times. So thank you for joining us. Have a great day.